The smoke curled through the cracks in the cabin walls like ghostly fingers reaching for Margaret Sullivan. She pressed her back against the rough wooden planks, her hands clutching her swollen belly as another contraction seized her body. Outside, the Wyoming winter of 1872 howled with fury, but inside, the crackling flames from the overturned lantern had begun their deadly dance across the floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just 3 days ago, she had buried her husband Thomas beneath the frozen earth. The fever had taken him swiftly, leaving her alone in their homestead, 40 miles from the nearest settlement. Now, as labor pains racked her body and fire consumed her only shelter, Margaret faced the very real possibility that she and her unborn child would join Thomas before the sun rose again. The cabin had been their dream. Thomas Sullivan, a former railroad worker from Boston, had saved every penny for 5 years to buy this patch of land in the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains. Margaret remembered the day they'd arrived, her husband's green eyes bright with hope as he surveyed the virgin territory. "We'll build something lasting here, Maggie," he'd said, using the pet name only he was allowed. "Something our children will be proud of." They'd worked side by side through that first brutal summer, Thomas felling trees while Margaret cleared brush and tended their small vegetable garden. By autumn, they had 4 walls and a roof, modest by any standard, but it was theirs. The following spring brought news of Margaret's pregnancy, and Thomas had worked even harder, expanding the cabin and trading furs for supplies in Cheyenne, whenever he could make the journey. But the land was unforgiving. The summer of 1872 brought drought, followed by an early, savage winter. Game became scarce, and Thomas was forced to venture farther from home to hunt. It was during one of these expeditions that he'd fallen through thin ice, soaking through his clothes. By the time he'd stumbled home, the chill had settled deep in his bones. The fever came fast and burned hot, and no amount of Margaret's nursing could break it. She'd wrapped his body in their best blanket and dragged him on a makeshift sledge to a small rise overlooking the valley. The ground was so frozen it had taken her 2 days to dig a grave deep enough. She'd said prayers she half remembered from childhood and marked the spot with stones arranged in a cross. Then she'd returned to the empty cabin to wait for her baby to come. The contractions had started that morning, earlier than expected. Margaret had been stoking the fire when the first wave hit, causing her to stumble. The lantern on the table wobbled, tipped, and crashed to the floor. Oil spread like water, and flames followed instantly. In her condition, Margaret could barely move fast enough to avoid the spreading fire, let alone extinguish it. Now, trapped in the corner farthest from the door, she watched the flames consume everything she and Thomas had built. The chest containing her wedding dress, the rocking chair Thomas had crafted for the baby, the Bible her mother had given her when she'd left Philadelphia to marry a man her family considered beneath her station. All of it fuel for the hungry. Flames! Another contraction struck, this one stronger than the last. Margaret bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. The smoke was thickening, stinging her eyes and burning her throat. She knew she had to move, had to get outside, but the fire blocked her path to the door. The window, if she could reach the window, she attempted to stand, using the wall for support. Her legs trembled, whether from fear or exhaustion she couldn't tell. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly within her. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing God, her unborn child, or the spirit of her departed husband. "Please, not like this." The cabin groaned as the fire weakened its supports. Burning debris began falling from the ceiling. Margaret made her decision. Better to die trying to escape than to wait for the roof to collapse. She gathered her skirts, took a deep breath of the increasingly toxic air, and prepared to make a dash through the flames. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought the Smoke was playing tricks on her eyes. A shadow moved beyond the wall of flames, too tall and purposeful to be a trick of the light. Then, through the inferno, a figure emerged. He moved with an otherworldly calm, as if the fire couldn't touch him. Margaret blinked hard, certain she was hallucinating, but the figure remained solid, real. He was Lakota, that much was clear from his dress and the way he wore his hair. Tall and lean, with skin the color of weathered oak and eyes dark as winter. Nights. He carried a blanket, thick, woven with patterns Margaret didn't recognize, and his expression was unreadable. No surprise at finding a white woman in labor in a burning cabin. No fear of the flames that licked at his doeskin leggings, just a steady, penetrating gaze that seemed to look through her rather than at her. Without a word, he spread the blanket over his shoulders and arms, creating a shield. Then he moved toward her with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, unsure whether this silent figure was salvation or another form of death. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see, and her lungs screamed for clean air. The Lakota scout reached her just as her legs gave out. He caught her with surprising gentleness, wrapping the blanket around both of them. The wool was somehow cool against her burning skin, and it seemed to repel the flames like water off oiled leather. She felt herself being lifted, carried like a child through the inferno. The heat was overwhelming, the roar of the fire deafening. But within the cocoon of the blanket, Margaret found a strange peace. They burst through what remained of the cabin door into the shocking cold of the Wyoming night. The scout carried her several yards from the burning structure before setting her down in a snowbank. The sudden cold against her back made her gasp. But it was clean, blessed air that filled her lungs. Another contraction hit, harder than any before. Margaret doubled over, unable to suppress a cry of pain. The scout knelt beside her, his dark eyes assessing. He spoke then, just one word in accented English. Soon. The cabin collapsed behind them with a tremendous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. Margaret watched her home, her memories, her last connection to Thomas disappear into the flames. But there was no time for grief. Her body was demanding all her attention now. The baby was coming. The scout moved with quiet efficiency. He cleared a space in the snow, laid down the miraculous blanket, and helped Margaret onto it. From somewhere, she didn't see where, he produced a knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. Margaret's heart seized with fresh fear, but he merely used it to cut strips from the hem of his own shirt. The next hour blurred into a haze of pain and effort. The scout never spoke again, but his presence was strangely comforting. He seemed to know exactly what to do, supporting her when she needed to push, offering her snow to wet her parched lips, never once showing impatience or disgust at the messy, primal business of birth. When the baby finally emerged, a girl, healthy and screaming her displeasure at the cold world, the scout cut the cord with his knife and wrapped the infant in another section of his shirt. He handed the baby to Margaret with something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell in the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire. Margaret looked down at her daughter, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. The baby had Thomas's nose and her own stubborn chin. "Grace," she whispered. "Her name is Grace." It seemed fitting, a gift of grace in the midst of loss and destruction. The scout nodded as if he understood. He rose and walked to the edge of the firelight, returning with an armload of wood. Working quickly, he built a small fire, controlled, safe, nothing like the inferno that had nearly claimed them. The warmth was welcome, and Margaret huddled close. Grace nestled against her chest. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion crashed over Margaret like a wave. She fought to keep her eyes open, afraid that if she slept, she'd wake to find her mysterious savior gone, leaving her alone with a newborn in the Wyoming wilderness. The scout seemed to sense her fear. He touched her shoulder gently and spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "Rest, I watch." Margaret wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why had he helped her? But her body had other plans. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite her best efforts, she felt herself sliding towards sleep. The last thing she saw was the scout sitting cross-legged by the fire, his blanket, somehow unscorched despite their passage through the flames, draped around his shoulders, his dark eyes vigilant in the night. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold when Margaret stirred. The first thing she noticed was warmth, not the terrifying heat of flames, but the gentle warmth of fur against her skin. She was wrapped in the scout's blanket, with Grace tucked securely against her chest. The baby made small, contented sounds in her sleep. Her tiny fist curled around a strand of Margaret's hair. The second thing she noticed was the shelter. Sometime during the night, the scout had constructed a lean-to using pine boughs and what looked like pieces of salvaged timber from the cabin. It blocked the worst of the wind, creating a pocket of relative comfort in the vast wilderness. The fire still burned steadily, and beside it sat a collection of items that made Margaret's breath catch. A water pouch made from what appeared to be deer bladder. A small iron pot, miraculously intact from the cabin ruins, filled with melted snow, strips of dried meat, wild onions, and some kind of root vegetable she didn't recognize. The scout had spent the night not just watching, but providing. He sat at the edge of their small camp, his back to her, facing the rising sun. His hair, which she now saw clearly in the morning light, was streaked with premature grey despite his apparent youth. Perhaps 30 winters, she guessed. He wore traditional Lakota clothing, but with additions that suggested contact with white settlements, a leather vest with brass buttons, canvas trousers beneath his leggings. As if sensing her awakening, he turned. His face, which had seemed stern by firelight, showed unexpected gentleness in the dawn. He gestured to the pot. "Drink." Margaret struggled to sit up without disturbing Grace. The scout moved to help her, his hands steady but respectful, maintaining a careful distance. Once she was upright, she accepted the pot gratefully, sipping the warm water. It had been flavored with pine needles, giving it a clean, almost medicinal taste. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "For everything. I don't even know your name." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Joseph White Eagle. Christian name from the mission school. Lakota name from my grandfather." It was the most he'd spoken, and Margaret sensed the weight behind the words. Mission. School meant forced education, cultural erasure. She'd heard stories from Thomas, who'd worked alongside Native Americans on the railroad. The systematic attempt to kill the Indian, save the man, as one administrator had put it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm Margaret Sullivan," she offered. "This is Grace." Joseph nodded, then busied himself with the fire. He added the meat to the pot, along with the roots and onions. The smell made Margaret's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Sometime before Thomas died, certainly, while the food cooked. Margaret studied their surroundings in the daylight. The cabin was completely gone, reduced to a smoking pile of charred logs and twisted metal. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the worst of the destruction in merciful white. Beyond the ruins, the landscape stretched endlessly, rolling, hills giving way to distant mountains, all of it empty of human habitation. "How did you find us?" she asked. Joseph stirred the pot with a stick, considering his answer. "Hunting. Saw smoke. Not normal smoke. Too big. Wrong place. Came to look. Lucky. For us you did. Margaret adjusted Grace, who was beginning to wake. We would have died, maybe. He ladled some of the broth into a tin cup that had survived the fire, handing it to her. Maybe not. You are strong. Margaret almost laughed. She didn't feel strong. She felt broken, lost, overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. She was alone with a newborn in the middle of winter, miles from civilization, with no shelter, no supplies, no husband. What was she going to do? As if reading her thoughts, Joseph said, "The trading post at Elkhorn Creek. 2 days' walk. 3. With the baby, they will help. I can't walk that far. Not yet. She gestured helplessly at herself, at Grace, at the vast emptiness around them. Not today, Joseph agreed. Rest today. Maybe tomorrow. I will stay. The simple declaration brought tears to Margaret's eyes. This stranger, this man from a people her own kind had wronged in countless ways, was offering to delay his own journey, to help her. She didn't know how to express her gratitude, so she simply nodded and focused on the broth. The day passed quietly. Joseph disappeared for hours at a time, returning with more firewood, more food, and once with a rabbit he'd snared. He showed Margaret how to wrap Grace in the Lakota way, creating a snug bundle that kept the baby warm while leaving Margaret's hands free. He melted snow for washing, helped Margaret clean herself and the baby with gentle efficiency that suggested, "Experience with childbirth. You have children?" Margaret asked during one of these quiet moments. A shadow crossed his face. "Had son. Died in the winter sickness 3 years ago. Wife followed soon after." The words were sparse, but Margaret heard the ocean of grief beneath them. She knew that particular emptiness, the way loss carved out your insides and left you hollow. "I'm sorry." Joseph shrugged, but his eyes remained distant. The way of things. Birth, death, birth again. The circle continues. As afternoon faded toward evening, Joseph began preparing for another night. He reinforced the shelter, gathered more firewood, and surprised Margaret by producing a small leather pouch from his pack. Inside were herbs she didn't recognize. He crushed some between his fingers, releasing a pungent aroma, and added them to a fresh pot of water. "For healing," he explained. "My grandmother's medicine helps the body recover from birth." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. It tasted bitter, but not unpleasant, and within minutes she felt a subtle easing of the deep ache in her muscles. Grace nursed contentedly, seemingly unfazed by their dramatic entry into the world. As darkness fell, Joseph built up the fire and settled into the same watchful position as the night before. Margaret found herself studying him in the firelight, trying to reconcile everything she'd been told about Indians with the reality of this quiet, competent man who'd saved their lives. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why help us? Your people have no reason to love mine." Joseph was quiet for so long, she wondered if he'd heard her. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "When I was a boy, maybe 10 winters, soldiers came to our village, killed many. My mother hid me in the river, under the bank. I watched." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I watched everything." Margaret's breath caught. She knew the stories, had heard them dismissed as exaggerations back east. But looking at Joseph's face, she knew they were true. I was angry. Wanted revenge, went to live with my mother's brother, a warrior. He taught me to fight, to track, to hunt, but also taught me this: hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it. He said, "Learn their ways, but do not become them. Keep what is good from both worlds." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night. "The mission school was punishment for a raid I did not join. They cut my hair, forbade my language, gave me Christian name. But I remembered my uncle's words, learned their language, their God, their ways, kept what was useful. When they released me, I became a scout. Not for soldiers, never for soldiers. For wagon trains, traders, people who need a guide. And tonight, when you saw the fire, Joseph looked at her directly, saw a woman in trouble, a child being born, nothing more. The color of skin, the shape of God, these matter to fire, to death, to new life crying in the night. His words settled over Margaret like a benediction. She thought of Thomas, of his dreams for this land, of the child they'd created together. Thought of the irony that it was a Lakota man who'd ensured their daughter's survival. Thomas, my husband, he believed in building bridges, she said softly. Between people, between worlds. He said the frontier didn't have to be about taking, it could be about sharing. Your husband was an unusual man. Yes, he was. Margaret smiled sadly. He would have liked you. They sat in companionable silence. As the fire burned low, Grace stirred and fussed, and Margaret tended to her needs while Joseph discreetly busied himself with checking the shelter. When the baby settled again, Margaret found herself fighting exhaustion but afraid to sleep. The vast darkness beyond their small circle of light pressed in, full of unknown threats. The wolves, she said suddenly. I heard them at night. Won't they? Joseph shook his head. Not here. This place has protection. What kind of protection? He hesitated, then pointed to markings she hadn't noticed before. Symbols carved into the trees surrounding their camp. Old signs, sacred markers. This was the ceremony ground once, long ago. Animals know. Respect such places. Margaret studied the symbols, curious despite her exhaustion. Your people's ceremonies? Older than my people, older than yours. The first people, the ancient ones. They knew how to speak to the land, how to ask for safety. Their marks still carry power. It should have sounded like superstition, but sitting there in the wilderness with her newborn daughter, alive against all odds, thanks to this man's intervention, Margaret found herself believing. The rational part of her mind, the part educated, in Philadelphia drawing rooms and lecture halls, might scoff, but her heart knew better. There were mysteries in this land, deeper than anything her world could explain. Will you tell me, she asked, about the ancient ones? About your people's stories? Joseph looked surprised. You want to know? Yes. If Grace is to grow up in this land, she should know its stories. All of them. For the first time since she'd met him, Joseph smiled fully. It transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. My grandmother was the storyteller. I am poor substitute, but I will try. He began slowly, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that suggested oral tradition passed down through generations. He told of the time before time, when the world was new and the boundaries between human and animal, spirit and flesh were fluid. Of Spider-Woman who wove the web of fate. Of White Buffalo Calf Woman who brought the sacred pipe. Of Trickster, Coyote whose pranks taught important lessons. Margaret listened, mesmerized. The stories were unlike anything from her own tradition. No clear moral lessons, no simple heroes and villains. Instead, they spoke of balance, of relationship, of the interconnectedness of all things. They painted a picture of a world where humans were not masters but participants, where wisdom came from understanding one's place in the great web of existence. As Joseph spoke, the fire burned lower, the stars wheeled overhead, and Grace slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The night no longer seemed threatening, but protective, like a great blanket thrown over the world. Margaret felt something shifting inside her, some fundamental understanding of where she was and what lay ahead. When Joseph finally fell silent, Margaret realized tears were streaming down her face, not tears of sorrow, but of something else. Recognition, perhaps, or release. Thank you, she whispered. Joseph nodded, understanding without words what she meant. Not just for the stories, but for everything. The rescue, the care, the bridge between worlds he'd offered so freely. Sleep. Now, he said, settling back into his watchful position. Tomorrow is soon enough for decisions. Margaret lay back, cradling Grace close. Through the gaps in the shelter, she could see stars, more stars than she'd ever noticed in her life, as if the sky itself was celebrating her daughter's arrival. She thought of Thomas, wondered if he was up there somewhere watching, wondered what he'd think of their unlikely guardian angel. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last coherent thought was a prayer, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but something simpler, more fundamental. A prayer of gratitude for unexpected kindness, for the mysterious ways help arrives when most needed, for the possibility that Grace might grow up in a world where boundaries between peoples could be crossed with compassion rather than violence. The fire crackled softly. The nightbirds called, and Joseph White Eagle kept watch, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of new life, a keeper of ancient wisdoms in a rapidly changing land. The morning brought unexpected warmth, a Chinook wind sweeping down from the mountains. To temporarily push back winter's grip, Margaret woke to find Joseph already up, studying the sky with a furrowed brow. Grace lay nestled against her chest, making small, sucking motions in her sleep. "The weather turns," Joseph said without looking. "At here, false spring will not last but gives us an opportunity." Margaret sat up carefully, her body protesting the movement. 2 days of rest had helped, but she still felt weak, unsteady. The thought of walking for days through the wilderness seemed impossible. Opportunity for what? To move. The snow will soften, make travel easier, but only for short time. Maybe 2 days before winter returns, harder than before. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret looked at the meager supplies they'd salvaged, at her tiny daughter, at the vast expanse of country between them and safety. "I don't know if I can make it." Joseph turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "Not to the trading post. Too far. But there is another place, closer, half a day's walk, maybe less if we go slow." "What place?" He hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "My winter camp, hidden valley, protected from wind, shelter, supplies, safe place to grow strong." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. Going deeper into the wilderness, farther from her own people, seemed like madness. But looking at Joseph, remembering all he'd done for them, she found her fears battling with a growing trust. This man had saved their lives and asked nothing in return. And what were her alternatives? Wait here for rescue that might never come? Attempt the journey to the trading post and risk Grace's life? "Your camp," she said slowly. "Would we be welcome there?" A ghost of a smile crossed Joseph's face. "No one there but memories. I have been wintering alone since—" He didn't finish. But Margaret understood, since his wife and son died. "All right," she heard herself saying. "We'll go to your camp." Joseph nodded, immediately beginning preparations. He fashioned a carrying sling from the salvaged blanket, showing Margaret how to secure Grace against her chest while keeping her hands free. From the ruins of the cabin, he salvaged anything useful. A knife, some nails, a small mirror miraculously unbroken. Everything went into a pack he created from deer hide and salvaged leather. By mid-morning, they were ready. Joseph shouldered the pack and helped Margaret to her feet. She swayed, dizzy from the effort, but his steady hand kept her upright. Grace whimpered at the movement, but settled quickly, lulled by the warmth of her mother's body. They set off slowly, Joseph leading the way through terrain that looked impassable to Margaret's eyes. He seemed to read the land like others might read a book, finding game trails invisible to her, avoiding deep drifts, choosing paths that offered shelter from the wind. Every few minutes he would pause, allowing her to rest, checking that Grace was secure. The Chinook wind grew stronger as they walked, turning the snow to slush underfoot. Water dripped from pine branches, creating a constant pattern like rain. Birds that had been silent for weeks began to call, fooled by the false spring. Margaret found herself oddly grateful for the deception. Without it, this journey would have been impossible. They'd been walking for perhaps 2 hours when Joseph suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence. Margaret froze, her heart racing. In the distance she heard it. Voices. Men's voices speaking English. Joseph pulled her behind a cluster of rocks, motioning for absolute quiet. Through the trees, Margaret could make out 3 figures on horseback. White men, heavily armed, their faces hard with purpose. As they drew closer, she could hear their conversation. "Tracks lead this way. Saw the smoke 2 nights back. Indians, sure as hell. Could be trappers." "Not likely." "Trappers. Don't build signal fires. Besides, Porter said he saw a brave man moving through here yesterday, Lakota by the look of him." Margaret felt Joseph tense beside her. She understood the danger immediately. These men were hunting Indians, any Indians. If they found Joseph, they'd shoot first, ask questions never, and her presence might not make any difference. She'd heard stories of white women found with Indian men, treated as captives regardless of the truth. The riders were moving closer, following a trail that would bring them within yards of their hiding spot. Grace chose that moment to stir, making small fussing sounds. Margaret pressed her closer, desperately trying to soothe her, but the baby was waking hungry. Joseph made a decision. He pressed the pack into Margaret's hands, then pointed to a narrow ravine that cut through the hillside behind them. His message was clear: take the baby and run, hide. He would deal with the men. Margaret grabbed his arm, shaking her head. If he confronted them, they'd kill him, but Joseph's expression was calm, resolved. He squeezed her shoulder once, then stepped out from behind the rocks. The riders saw him immediately. Guns appeared in their hands with practiced speed. "Hold it right there, Indian." Joseph raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible. When he spoke, his English was deliberately broken, playing into their expectations. "No trouble, just scout. Work for a wagon company." "Like hell you do." The lead rider, a grizzled man with cold blue eyes, kept his rifle trained on Joseph's chest. "What wagon company?" "Mackenzie outfit, from Fort Laramie. Scout ahead for spring crossing." The men exchanged glances. The Mackenzie name carried weight. One of the biggest freight companies operating between the Missouri and the coast. But suspicion remained thick in the air. "Where's your papers, then?" "Mackenzie always gives his scouts papers." Joseph reached slowly for his vest, producing a folded document. Margaret, watching from the ravine where she'd retreated with Grace, recognized it as authentic. She'd seen similar papers when Thomas had worked for the railroad. But would these men believe it? The leader snatched the paper, scanning it quickly. His expression shifted from suspicion to disappointment. "Shit, he's legal, boys." "Could be forged," one of the others suggested. "Indians are getting clever these days." "Nah, I know Mackenzie's mark. This is real." He handed the paper back to Joseph with obvious reluctance. "What are you doing out here anyway? Season's wrong for scouting. Hunting, trail meet for spring drive. See smoke 2 nights back, go to look, nothing there. Cabin burned down." "Yeah, we saw that too. Settlers probably. Damn fools building way out here." The leader spat tobacco juice into the snow. "You see any other Indians? We're tracking a war party. Killed some folks over near Sage Creek." Joseph shook his head. "No war party. Too cold. Warriors stay in winter camps." The men conferred quietly. Margaret held her breath, praying Grace would stay quiet. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the leader made a decision. "All right, Scout, you can go. But if you see any of your red brothers stirring up trouble, you better report it. Mackenzie won't protect you if you're helping hostiles." Joseph nodded, keeping his expression neutral. The riders wheeled their horses and continued on their way, their voices fading into the distance. Only when they were completely gone did Joseph signal for Margaret to emerge. She came out slowly, Grace beginning to cry in earnest now. "Those men!" "Hunters," Joseph said simply, "always hunters, looking for an excuse to kill Indians, any Indians." "But you had papers. You were legitimate." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Papers make me good Indian, useful Indian. Without them—" He drew a finger across his throat. Margaret shuddered, understanding more fully the constant danger Joseph lived with. Even helping her put him at risk. If those men had found them together, they might have shot first, assuming he'd kidnapped her. The papers might not have mattered then. They resumed their journey, but the encounter had shaken them both. Joseph moved more cautiously now, taking longer routes that kept them in heavy cover. Margaret found herself jumping at every sound, imagining more riders, more guns. Grace, perhaps sensing her mother's tension, remained fretful. The sun was past its zenith when Joseph finally relaxed. They'd entered a different kind of country, steeper, more heavily forested, with exposed rock faces and hidden valleys. The Chinook wind was blocked here, and the air grew colder, but Joseph seemed more at ease. "Close now," he said, helping Margaret over a fallen log. "My people's land, old territory. Whites don't come here. Too rough, no gold, no good farming. Safe." They climbed through a narrow defile between two cliff faces, the path so cunningly concealed Margaret would never have found it on her own. At the top, the land opened into a small valley, perhaps half a mile across, surrounded by protective ridges. A stream ran through the center, partially frozen, but still flowing. Stands of pine and aspen provided shelter, and at the far end, built against a southern-facing cliff, stood a structure that made Margaret catch her breath. It wasn't a typical Indian dwelling, not a teepee or wickiup. Instead, it was a hybrid construction, part log cabin, part traditional shelter, built to last. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, the roof covered with pine boughs and hide. A stone chimney rose from one end, and actual glass windows, small but real, flanked a sturdy door. "Your home?" Margaret asked. "Winter Lodge. Built it 3 years ago, after—" He didn't need to finish. After his family died, after he'd chosen solitude over the reminders of shared life. They made their way down into the valley, Joseph pointing out features as they walked. The stream had fish, trout that survived the winter in deep pools. The southern exposure meant longer sunlight, earlier snowmelt. Natural hot springs emerged from the rocks near the cliff, creating pockets of warmth even in the deepest winter. Caves in the cliff face provided additional storage, natural refrigeration. "It's perfect," Margaret breathed, "like a hidden paradise." Joseph's expression was unreadable. Sanctuary, but also prison, cut off from the world, from people, good for healing, not good for living, not alone. They reached the lodge as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Joseph produced a key, another surprise, and unlocked the heavy door. Inside, Margaret found herself in a space that defied every expectation she'd had about Indian dwellings. The main room was perhaps 20 feet square, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Wooden shelves held books, actual books in English, and what she assumed was Lakota. Maps covered one wall, detailed topographical charts mixed with traditional pictographs. A table and chairs, roughly made but sturdy, occupied the center. In one corner stood a bed frame with a cornhusk mattress. Everything spoke of a man caught between worlds, trying to forge something new from the fragments of both. Joseph busied himself starting a fire while Margaret settled into a chair, exhausted beyond measure. Grace nursed hungrily, finally content after the long journey. As warmth filled the room, Margaret felt herself relaxing for the first time since Thomas's death. They were safe. They had shelter. They had a chance. From hidden caches, Joseph produced Supplies that seemed miraculous after their deprivation, dried meat and vegetables, cornmeal, even tea and sugar. He prepared a simple meal while Margaret explored the lodge, marveling at the ingenuity of its construction. The windows, he explained, had come from an abandoned army outpost. The stove was a trade from a Mormon settler. The books were gifts from a missionary who'd understood that forcing conversion and sharing knowledge were different things. As they ate, Joseph told her more about the valley. His grandfather had shown it to him as a boy, one of many secret places the Lakota preserved against future need. When the reservation system tightened, when the buffalo vanished, when the old ways became impossible, such places offered refuge. He'd claimed this one after his personal losses, needing solitude to wrestle with grief. "But you leave sometimes," Margaret observed. "To scout, to trade. Cannot live only in the past," Joseph replied. "Must walk in both worlds even when it hurts. My son." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "My son would be 5 now. Same age I was when grandfather first brought me here. I promised to show him. Now." He trailed off, but Margaret understood. The future he'd planned had died with his child. Now he moved through life fulfilling obligations, maintaining connections, but without the driving purpose family provided. They sat in silence as darkness fell outside. Grace slept peacefully in Margaret's arms, her tiny face relaxed in the way only infants achieve. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, wind sighed through the pines, but the sturdy walls kept them warm and secure. "Tomorrow," Joseph said finally, "I will show you the springs. Warm water, good for healing, help the body recover from birth. Also show you where food is stored, how to work the stove, where to find water when the stream freezes." "You're leaving?" Margaret felt a stab of panic. "Must check trap lines, hunt while the weather holds. Back before dark, you are safe here. Door locks from inside. No one knows this place except me." Margaret nodded, trying to master her fear. She'd been alone before, those terrible days after Thomas died. But this felt different. More isolated, yet paradoxically safer. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph added, "This valley is protected, not just hidden, protected. Old medicine. Grandfather's grandfather made ceremonies here, asking spirits for sanctuary. Animals know. Men feel it too, turn away without knowing why. You felt it coming through the pass?" Margaret considered. She had felt something. A sense of crossing a threshold, entering space that was somehow set apart. Yes, like walking into a church. Same thing, sacred space, different tradition, same purpose. They prepared for night, Joseph insisting Margaret take the bed while he made a pallet near the fire. She protested, but he was firm. "You need rest, real rest, cannot heal on the ground." As she settled into the unexpected comfort of the corn husk, mattress, Grace beside her in a nest of blankets, Margaret found herself thinking about the strangeness of life. A week ago, she'd been a frontier wife, struggling but hopeful, building a future with her husband. Now she was a widow, sheltering in an Indian lodge, dependent on the kindness of a man her people had wronged in countless ways. Yet here, in this hidden valley, she felt safer than she had in months. "Joseph," she called softly, "why did you really help us? Not just because we needed it. You could have sent us to the trading post, pointed the way. Why bring us here?" In the firelight, she saw him consider the question. When he spoke, his voice carried truth, hard-won from pain. "Night of fire, saw a woman fighting for life, for a child's life. Remembering my wife, same fight, different battle. She lost, you won. Seemed like sign, chance to help what I could not save. And now we're a burden to you, complications you don't need. No." The word was firm. "Not a burden, reminder." Of what? That life continues, that death is not the end of the story, that sometimes strangers become family in ways blood cannot make. He paused, then added quietly, My wife would say you were sent, would say spirits knew I needed purpose again, would say a child born in fire must have a destiny worth protecting. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. In her own tradition, she might have called it providence, God's plan, divine intervention. The names differed, but the underlying truth remained. Sometimes help came from unexpected quarters, bridges formed across impossible divides, hope emerged from ashes, literally in their case. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." But Joseph was already asleep, or pretending to be. Margaret lay back, listening to the night sounds of the valley, the distant howl of wolves that seemed more lonely than threatening, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the settling of logs in the fireplace. Grace stirred, making small sounds, and Margaret soothed her with a touch. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. She had to learn to survive in this place, had to decide what came next for her and Grace. The trading post still waited, civilization still called. But tonight, in this hidden sanctuary, she was content to simply be, to rest, to heal, to consider the possibility that her daughter's dramatic entry into the world might indeed mark a special destiny, one that required this exact moment, this exact place, this exact guardian. The fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead, visible through the small windows. And in the hidden valley that had sheltered generations of seekers, 3 broken people began the slow process of becoming something new together, not replacing what was lost, but creating what was needed for the journey ahead. The hot springs emerged from the mountainside like nature's own miracle, steam rising in ethereal wisps against the morning air. Margaret stood at the edge, marveling at the natural pools carved into rock over countless centuries. The water was crystal clear, revealing smooth stones at the bottom, and warm enough to send clouds of vapor into the cold mountain air. Joseph had led her here at first light, carrying Grace while Margaret navigated the narrow path. Now he stood back respectfully as she tested the water with her hand. The temperature was perfect, hot enough to soothe but not scald. "Minerals in water help healing," he explained. "My people have come here for generations. Sacred waters, good medicine." Margaret had been raised to be modest, but the promise of warm water after days of cold and pain overcame her reservations. Joseph turned away without being asked, busying himself with checking snares he'd set along the tree line. With careful movements, Margaret undressed and lowered herself into the pool, gasping as the heat embraced her battered body. The relief was immediate and profound. Muscles she hadn't realized were clenched began to relax. The deep ache from childbirth eased. For the first time since the fire, she felt truly clean. She closed her eyes, letting the mineral-rich water work its magic. Grace lay nearby on a bed of soft pine needles, wrapped in the miraculous blanket that had saved them from the flames. The baby seemed content, making small cooing sounds as she watched the play of sunlight through the trees. The scene was so peaceful it felt almost dreamlike. "Your wife," Margaret called to Joseph, who was examining tracks near the forest edge. "She came here too?" "Yes, many times," said the waters sang to her. He remained focused on his task, giving her privacy. "She was with child when the sickness came. Would have given birth in spring." Margaret's heart ached for him. To lose both a wife and an unborn child, the parallel to her own loss, was painful. Yet Joseph had saved her and Grace, had given them what he couldn't give his own family. The generosity of that act overwhelmed her. She bathed in silence after that, washing away not just the physical remnants of their ordeal, but something deeper. When she finally emerged, wrapping herself in the clean clothes Joseph had provided from his stores, she felt renewed in more than body. They spent the morning at the springs, Joseph teaching her which pools were best for different purposes, the hottest for sore muscles, the cooler ones for drinking. a special alcove where the minerals concentrated for treating wounds. He showed her how to identify the healing plants that grew in the warm microclimate around the springs, explained which ones helped with milk production for nursing mothers, which eased pain, which fought infection. Grace nursed contentedly while they talked, the baby clearly thriving despite their dramatic circumstances. Margaret found herself studying Joseph as he spoke, noting the way his hands moved when he explained things, the depth of knowledge he carried, the gentle way he handled even the smallest plant. This was not the savage her Eastern education had prepared her to fear, but a man of learning and wisdom, different from her own but no less valuable. By midday, they returned to the lodge. Joseph prepared to check his trap lines as promised, but first he showed Margaret around the valley in daylight. The hidden paradise revealed more secrets. Caves for storage, a smokehouse cleverly concealed among the rocks, patches where medicinal plants grew in abundance during summer. He pointed out game trails, showed her how to read the signs of different animals, explained which were dangerous and which were simply curious. The elk come down in deep winter, he said, indicating a meadow near the stream. Easy hunting then, deer too. Bears sleep in caves on the north ridge. Stay away from there until true spring. Wolves pass through but don't den here. They know this is a human place. How long have your people known about this valley? Joseph considered. Story is about 7 generations, maybe more. Was refuge during the bad times, when Crow raided from the north, when the first white men brought disease. Hidden places like this kept people alive. And now it keeps us alive, Margaret said softly. Joseph looked at her directly. Yes, but questions come. How long do you stay? What do you want for the future? I will help either way, but I must know. For plan, it was the conversation Margaret had been dreading. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, survival had been enough, but now, in this place of safety, larger questions loomed. Where did she belong? What kind of life could she give Grace? I don't know, she admitted. Everything I planned died. With Thomas, the homestead is gone. I have no family back east who would welcome me. They disowned me when I married beneath my station. The trading post, she trailed off, thinking of what awaited her there. Pity at best, exploitation at worst. A widow with a newborn was vulnerable in frontier society. You could stay here, Joseph said carefully. Through winter at least. Spring brings choices. Now only survival matters. The offer hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to examine. Margaret knew what he was risking. Harboring a white woman and child could bring trouble he didn't need. Yet the alternative terrified her. The thought of facing the world alone with Grace, of trying to build a life from nothing. I would be grateful to stay, she said finally, until spring, until I'm stronger and can decide wisely. Joseph nodded, satisfaction flickering across his features. Good. Now I will show you everything. How to bank fire so it lasts through the night, where emergency supplies are hidden. How to bar the door properly. Must know these things. The afternoon became a practical education. Joseph was a thorough teacher, ensuring Margaret understood not just what to do, but why. The stove had quirks, a damper that stuck, a particular way the wood needed to be stacked. The well outside could freeze in extreme cold, but there was always water from the hot springs. The root cellar stayed constant temperature, perfect for storage. Signal methods if she needed help, specific patterns of smoke during day, arrangements of lanterns at night. You're preparing me to be alone, Margaret observed. Preparing you to be capable, Joseph corrected. Difference between alone and helpless. You are a strong woman. Survived what would kill many, but strength needs knowledge to be useful. As shadows lengthened, Joseph gathered his hunting gear. Margaret felt anxiety rising at the prospect of his departure, even for a few hours. The lodge suddenly seemed very isolated, the valley very empty. Bears are sleeping, yes? She asked, trying to keep fear from her voice. Yes, and the door is strong. You are safe here, but take this. He handed her a revolver, a well-maintained army. Colt. You know guns? Thomas taught me to shoot. For protection on the frontier. Good, this is loaded. More ammunition in the chest by bed, but I won't need it. Valley protects its own. With that reassurance, he departed, disappearing into the forest with the silent efficiency that seemed second nature to him. Margaret barred the door as instructed, then stood in the sudden quiet of the lodge. Grace slept peacefully in a cradle Joseph had retrieved from storage, hand-carved, beautiful work that spoke of preparation for a child who never lived to use it. The afternoon passed slowly. Margaret explored the lodge more thoroughly, discovering treasures that revealed more about her mysterious protector. A journal written in careful script, mixing English and Lakota, documenting plants and their uses. Sketches of extraordinary skill showing animals, landscapes, people. A Bible with margin notes in multiple hands, suggesting it had passed through several owners. A medicine bundle wrapped in deerskin, clearly sacred, which she didn't touch. On a high shelf, she found a photograph, a formal portrait of the kind traveling photographers made. It showed Joseph, younger and less careworn, standing beside a beautiful Lakota woman. She held a young boy, perhaps 2 years old, who had his father's serious eyes. They looked happy, proud, and complete. Margaret studied the image for a long time, understanding better the magnitude of Joseph's loss and the generosity of his aid to her. As dusk approached, she built up the fire and prepared a simple meal from the supplies Joseph had shown her. The mundane tasks felt strange in this extraordinary setting. She was a Philadelphia debutante, turned frontier wife, turned widow, now sheltering in an Indian lodge, learning to survive in ways she'd never imagined. If her mother could see her now, the thought brought unexpected laughter. Her mother, with her rigid ideas about propriety and place, would be horrified. But Thomas would understand. He'd always said the frontier demanded adaptation, required people to shed old limitations and discover new capabilities. "We make ourselves new out here, Maggie," he'd told her. "Become who we need to be, not who we were told to be." A sound outside interrupted her reverie. Footsteps on the porch, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, too hesitant. Not Joseph's silent tread. Margaret grabbed the revolver, her heart pounding. The footsteps paused at the door. Then came a knock, loud, demanding. "Anyone in there? Open up." A white man's voice, slurred with drink. Margaret remained silent, praying he'd leave. But the knock came again, harder. "Saw smoke from the chimney. Know someone here. Open up or I'll break it down." Margaret recognized the voice now. One of the riders from that morning, the one who'd suggested Joseph's papers were forged. Somehow he'd found the valley and tracked them here. Fear turned to ice in her veins. "I'm armed," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "State your business." Well, a woman. The man's laugh was ugly. "White woman, by the sound. What are you doing in that Indian's hideout, missy? He is keeping you prisoner?" "No one's keeping me anywhere. I'm here by choice, now leave." "Don't think so. That buck's got something of mine. Owes me from a card game last fall. Figured I'd collect while he's gone." Margaret doubted the truth of this. More likely the man had followed them, waited for Joseph to leave, saw an opportunity. She checked the revolver, ensuring it was ready. Grace stirred in her cradle, but mercifully didn't cry. "You're mistaken," she said firmly. "Please leave. My husband will return soon." Husband. Another ugly laugh. "That's what you call him. Squawman's whore is more like it. Open this door, woman. Got business with you now." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret backed away from the door, positioning herself between it and Grace. She raised the revolver, aiming at chest. Height. If he broke through, she'd have one chance. The door shuddered under a heavy impact. The man was trying to break it down, but Joseph had built well. The bar held. Another impact, cursing, then sudden silence. Margaret strained to hear, weapon trembling in her hands. A different sound came, a thud, like something heavy falling. Then footsteps, but familiar ones this time. Joseph's voice came quietly. "Mrs. Sullivan, safe to open." With shaking hands, Margaret lifted the bar. Joseph stood on the porch, his face grim. The intruder lay unconscious at his feet, blood trickling from his temple. "Heard him from the ridge," Joseph explained. "Came fast. You hurt?" "No. He didn't get in. Just frightened me." Margaret lowered the gun, her legs suddenly weak. "He said you owed him money." "Lie. This one always causes trouble. Drinks, fights, blames Indians for his failures." Joseph dragged the unconscious man off the porch with efficient disgust. "We'll leave him at the valley entrance. When he wakes, won't remember how to return. Old medicine confuses such minds. Won't he bring others? Tell them about this place." Joseph shook his head. "Who believes drunkard stories about hidden valleys? Besides, he trespassed, threatened white woman. His friends know this is wrong, even if they hate Indians. They won't help him." Margaret watched as Joseph tied the man's hands and feet, then loaded him onto his own horse like a sack of grain. The casual competence was reassuring and unsettling in equal measure. This man who showed such gentleness with her and Grace was equally capable of violence when needed. The duality reminded her that the frontier demanded such contradictions of everyone who survived it. While Joseph dealt with the intruder, Margaret checked on Grace, who had slept through the entire incident. The baby's peaceful face calmed her racing heart. Whatever happened, she had to be strong for her daughter, had to learn not just to survive, but to protect. Joseph returned an hour later, the intruder's horse in tow. "Left him where his friends." "We'll find him. Took his weapons. He won't trouble us again." "How can you be sure?" Joseph's smile was cold. "Told him the valley is cursed, that spirits of dead warriors guard it, that any white man who enters uninvited will face judgment. He may not believe, but fear will keep him away. Such men are cowards beneath the bluster." They prepared dinner together, a strange domesticity after the evening's violence. Joseph had brought back 2 rabbits and a grouse from his trapline. He showed Margaret how to clean and prepare them, another skill for survival. As they worked, he told her about other defensive measures, hidden weapons, caches, escape routes if the lodge was compromised, places in the valley where one person could hold off many. "You prepare for war," Margaret observed. "Prepare for possibility. Peace is preference, but frontier teaches readiness. Your husband understood this, yes?" "Yes. Thomas believed in being prepared. He just wasn't prepared for fever. No one prepares for everything. Death finds its way. But life continues, adapts, survives. You prove this. Your daughter proves this." After dinner, they sat by the fire, Grace cradled in Margaret's arms. The earlier fear had faded, replaced by a strange sense of security. Not the security of civilization, with its laws and conventions, but something more primal. The security of strength recognized and respected, of sanctuary defended, of capability proven. "I fired a shot," Joseph said suddenly. "When I stopped him, your neighbor will have heard, may come to investigate." "My neighbor?" Margaret was confused. The valley seemed completely isolated. "Marcus Freeman, trapper, lives 3 valleys over. Good man, married to a Cheyenne woman. They winter near here most years. He'll recognize my rifle's sound and know something happened." "Will he come?" "Perhaps. Tomorrow, if at all. Marcus minds his own business, but gunfire is everyone's concern. Out here," Joseph paused, "might be good for you to meet him, and Sarah, his wife. She knows healing, especially women's medicine, could help you recover fully." The idea of other people nearby was both comforting and unsettling. Margaret had begun to think of the valley as their private world, separate from outside complications. But she recognized the wisdom in Joseph's suggestion. She needed allies, needed to understand the broader community of this wilderness, such as it was. Do they have children? 2 boys, half-breeds, like... Joseph caught himself. Like Grace will be considered if we stay together through winter. World has names for such children, not kind names. The implication hung heavy in the air. By staying. Here, by accepting Joseph's protection, Margaret was crossing lines her world drew firmly. Grace would grow up between worlds, belonging fully to neither. It was a burden Margaret hadn't considered in the immediacy of survival. Thomas dreamed of a different world, she said quietly, where such divisions mattered less, where people were judged by character, not color. He thought the frontier might birth that world. Pretty dream, but the frontier often makes divisions worse. Fear drives people to extremes. Do you regret helping us? The complications it brings? Joseph was quiet for a long moment. No regret. But truth must be faced. You stay here through winter, stories will spread. White woman living with an Indian man. Some will say captive, some will say worse. When you return to your world, those stories follow. And if I don't return to that world? The question surprised them both. Margaret hadn't meant to voice it, hadn't even fully formed the thought. But once spoken, it demanded examination. Joseph studied her carefully. Then a different future opens. Harder in some ways, free in others. But choice must be yours, made with clear eyes. Not from fear or gratitude or loneliness. From understanding what each path means. Margaret nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words. These were not decisions for tonight, not choices to be made in the shadow of crisis. But seeds had been planted, possibilities acknowledged. The winter would give time for clarity. Outside, wind howled through the pines, but the lodge remained. Warm and secure. Grace slept peacefully, innocent of the complex world she'd entered. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed loss and now sheltered unexpected hope. Joseph rose to check the door's bar, then paused. From a chest near his bed, he withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. He approached Margaret almost shyly, unusual for a man so confident in action. "This was made for my son," he said, unwrapping the object. "Never used." It was a cradle board, beautifully crafted, decorated with beadwork in patterns that seemed to tell stories. The wood was smooth as silk, the leather soft and supple. Every detail spoke of love, hope, preparation for a future that never came. "I can't," Margaret began, but Joseph shook his head. "Not a gift. Loan. For Grace. While you stay. Practical thing. Keeps babies safe, lets mother work. But also," he struggled for words, "also healing, for board to hold the child again, for a child to have what was made with love." Circle continues. Margaret accepted the cradleboard, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. She understood what this offering cost him, what it meant. Not a romantic gesture, but something deeper. The sharing of sacred things, the weaving of separate griefs into shared purpose. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving us, for sheltering us, for—" She gestured helplessly at the lodge, the valley, the complex new world opening before them. "No thanks needed. We do what the situation requires." What spirits! A guide. Tomorrow brings what tomorrow brings. Tonight we are safe. Baby is healthy. Fire is warm. Enough. He returned to his pallet by the fire, leaving Margaret to process the day's revelations. She looked down at Grace, at the cradleboard that would carry her, at the strange new life taking shape around them. The future remains uncertain, full of hard choices and unclear paths. But for tonight, Joseph was right. They were safe. They were warm. They had found an unlikely sanctuary and an unexpected alliance. It was enough. The wind continued its lonely song outside. But within the lodge, 3 lives began the delicate process of weaving together, creating something new from Loss, finding strength in shared solitude, building bridge between worlds that Grace would someday walk with confidence. The valley kept its secrets, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the hidden places of the frontier, new forms of family quietly took root. Marcus Freeman arrived with the dawn, his approach announced by the barking of dogs and the jingling of trap. Chains. Margaret watched from the window as Joseph went out to meet him, the two men clasping forearms in greeting before falling into rapid conversation. She couldn't hear their words, but their gestures told the story, Joseph explaining the previous night's events, Marcus nodding with understanding. The trapper was a bear of a man, broad-shouldered and bearded, with laugh lines carved deep. Around his eyes, his clothes were a practical mix of frontier gear and native influences, and he moved with the same easy confidence Margaret had observed in Joseph. When he glanced toward the lodge and saw her watching, he touched his fur cap. In greeting, his smile warm and genuine. Behind him, a woman dismounted from a painted pony. She was clearly Native American, Cheyenne, Joseph had said, but dressed in a combination of traditional and European clothing that somehow looked entirely natural. Her long black hair was braided with ribbons, and her eyes held both wisdom and humor. This must be Sarah. Margaret stepped onto the porch, Grace in her arms. The mountain morning was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. Sarah approached with measured steps, her gaze taking in everything. Margaret's appearance, the way she held Grace, the subtle signs that spoke of recent childbirth and trauma. "You are the woman who gave birth in fire," Sarah said without preamble. Her English was accented but clear. Joseph told Marcus, "The spirits protected you and your daughter." Yes, Joseph saved us. We owe him everything." Sarah's eyes crinkled. "Perhaps, or perhaps you save each other. The spirits work in circles, not straight lines." She moved closer, studying Grace with the practiced eye of a mother and healer. "May I?" Margaret hesitated only a moment before, allowing Sarah to examine Grace. The woman's hands were gentle but sure, checking the baby's color, her breathing, the soft spot on her skull. She nodded approval. Strong child, born between worlds, fire and snow, death and life. Such children often carry special medicine. She looked at Margaret directly. "You heal well. The body, I mean. The heart takes its own time. I'm recovering. The hot springs help. Joseph has been—" Margaret struggled for words. "He's been incredibly kind. Joseph knows loss, makes him see clear, help without conditions, but also makes him fragile in ways that don't show. You understand this?" Margaret nodded. She did understand, perhaps better than anyone. Grief created both strength and vulnerability, often in the same moment. She'd seen it in Joseph's eyes when he'd offered the cradle board, felt it in the careful distance he maintained, even while providing intimate care. The men joined them on the porch, Marcus carrying a pack that clinked with metal tools. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "Joseph tells me you had some trouble last night. Jake Prescott's always been a mean drunk, but this is bold even for him." "You know him?" "Know of him. Troublemaker, likes to blame others for his own failings. Indians are favorite targets. Won't be the last of his kind you meet out here, sorry to say, but he won't bother you again. Word spreads fast in these parts. Attack a woman with a baby, even a woman living with an Indian, and you mark yourself as beyond the pale." The casual way he said, "living with an Indian," made Margaret's cheeks warm. "I'm just sheltering here, until spring, until I decide." "No need to explain to us," Marcus said gently. "Sarah and I know something about crossing lines, making choices others don't understand. You do what's right for you and that baby. Let the rest sort itself." They spent the morning together, a strange but comfortable gathering. Sarah examined Margaret more thoroughly, providing herbs and instructions for complete recovery. She showed Margaret how to use the cradle board properly, demonstrating with the ease of experience. Her own boys, she explained, were nearly grown. Now, 12 and 14, out on their first solo hunt with their cousin. They struggle sometimes, Sarah admitted. Not native enough for some, not white enough for others. But Marcus and I taught them to be strong in both worlds. Your Grace will need that strength too, whatever path you choose. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast. Joseph was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Marcus joined him, both men moving with coordinated precision that spoke of past dangers faced together. But the lead rider carried a white flag, an actual piece of cloth tied to a stick. As the group drew closer, Margaret recognized the leader, James Mitchell, owner of the largest ranch in the territory. She'd met him once at a social gathering in Cheyenne before she and Thomas had moved to their homestead. He was known as a fair man, one who honored agreements and kept his word. Mitchell rode up slowly, hands visible, his men hanging back at a respectful distance. "White Eagle," he called. "Freeman, ladies." He touched his hat brim. "Come in peace. Need to talk." Joseph lowered his rifle slightly. "Talk then." "Had a visit from Jake Prescott this morning. Spinning tales about being ambushed, robbed. Says you got a white woman captive here. Now, I know Prescott for being a liar and a fool, but others are listening. There's talk of forming a rescue party." Margaret stepped forward. "I'm no captive, Mr. Mitchell. I'm here by choice. Mr. White Eagle saved my life and my daughter's. If anyone needs rescuing, it's from men like Prescott who threaten women and children." Mitchell studied her, taking in her obvious good health, the baby in her arms, the protective way both Joseph and Sarah flanked her. "Thought as much. You're the widow Sullivan, aren't you? Heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. But why are you here?" "To prevent bloodshed, ma'am. Prescott's got some hotheads stirred up. They're talking about riding. Up here in force, liberating you whether you want it or not. Figured I'd come get the truth, try to calm things down." Marcus spat to the side. "Since when do folks need liberating from safety and kindness?" "Since fear makes fools of otherwise sensible people," Mitchell replied. "Look, I got no quarrel with any of you. Joseph scouted for my drives, always been straight with me. But you know how it is. White women within Indian people assume the worst. Add Prescott's lies to the mix, and we got potential for real trouble." Joseph's expression was stony. "They come here with violence. They find violence. This valley is a sanctuary, has been for generations, will not let it be violated." "Nobody wants that," Mitchell said quickly. "That's why I'm here, trying to find a solution that keeps everyone whole." Sarah spoke up. "Solution is simple. People mind their own business. Women make her own choices. Men respect those choices or answer them." Mitchell sighed. "In a perfect world, yes, but this isn't that world. Not yet." He focused on Margaret. "Ma'am might help if you came to town, just to show folks you're not held against your will. Let them see you're healthy, the baby's fine. Might take the wind out of their sails." Margaret felt everyone's eyes on her. She understood what Mitchell was really saying. Her presence in town, her public statement of choice, could diffuse the situation, but it would also mean exposure, judgment, in questions she wasn't ready to answer, and it would mean leaving the valley's safety even temporarily. "When?" she asked. "Soon as possible. Today, if you're able. Got a wagon, you could ride comfortably." "I'll go," Margaret decided. "But Joseph comes with me, as my friend, my protector. If people have questions, they can ask directly. No hiding, no shame." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Might actually help. Show you're not isolated, not without support. Freeman, you and your missus want to come along. More witnesses, the better." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. "We'll come," Sarah said. "Good to stand together. Show that different kinds of families exist on the frontier, all valid, all deserving respect. They prepared quickly. Margaret, dressed in her best remaining clothes, made sure Grace was clean and content. Joseph wore his most civilized attire, the mix of native and European that marked him as a man of both worlds. Sarah helped Margaret arrange her hair, provided a shawl that added dignity to her appearance. "Remember," Sarah said quietly as they worked, "you owe explanation to no one. Stand tall, speak the truth, let them see strength, not shame." The ride to the settlement took 3 hours. Mitchell's men maintained professional distance, but Margaret caught their curious glances. She rode in the wagon with Sarah, Grace secured in the cradle board. Joseph and Marcus rode alongside, alert but calm. Mitchell led the way, occasionally dropping back to check on their comfort. As they neared the town, Margaret's anxiety grew. She'd been here before, a rough collection of buildings that served the surrounding ranches and homesteads. The general store, the saloon, the church that doubled as a school. Perhaps 200 people in total, but they represented civilization, judgment, the world she'd have to navigate if she chose to leave the valley. Word had clearly spread. People lined the main street, watching their arrival with undisguised curiosity. Margaret recognized many faces: the storekeeper's wife who'd sold her fabric, the farrier who'd shod their horses, the minister who'd offered prayers for Thomas's recovery. Their expressions ranged from sympathy to suspicion to outright disapproval. Mitchell led them to the general store, where a small platform served for public announcements. He helped Margaret down from the wagon, steady and respectful. Joseph stood close but not too close, his presence protective without being possessive. Sarah and Marcus flanked them like an honor guard. "Folks," Mitchell began, his voice carrying easily, "know there's been talk, rumors. Figured best to get the truth straight from the source." He stepped back, giving Margaret the floor. She took a breath, drawing strength from Grace's weight against her chest. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. Many of you knew my husband, Thomas. He died of fever 2 weeks ago, leaving me alone at our homestead. When my time came to give birth, I was alone. There was a fire. I would have died. My daughter would have died, if not for Joseph White Eagle." A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "He saved us, sheltered us, treated us with nothing but kindness and respect. I stay in his valley by choice, not force. I make my own decisions about my future and my daughter's future. No one has the right to question those decisions or threaten our safety." "But he's an Indian," someone called from the back. "It ain't proper." Margaret's eyes flashed. "What's not proper is letting a woman and baby die because of prejudice. What's not proper is spreading lies and threatening violence. Joseph White Eagle has shown more Christian charity than many who claim that name. I'll not stand here and defend decency to those who would judge it by skin color alone." The crowd stirred uneasily. The minister stepped forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, no one questions your gratitude, but surely you see how this appears. A widow alone with a savage—" "Careful, Reverend." Marcus Freeman's voice cut through like a blade. "That savage has saved more lives than you've blessed, including mine more than once. You want to talk about Christian behavior? Look at actions, not ancestry," Sarah added her voice. "I am Cheyenne. My husband is white. Our children are both and neither. Are we also improper, savage? Where does your judgment end?" The Reverend flushed but held his ground. "The Bible speaks against such unions. The Bible speaks of kindness. To strangers," Margaret interrupted, "of loving thy neighbor, of judging not. I've seen more biblical behavior from Joseph than from those who would condemn him." An older woman pushed through the crowd. Margaret recognized her, Mrs. Campbell, whose husband ran the largest dry goods store. She'd always been kind, offering advice when Margaret was new to frontier life. "Child," Mrs. Campbell said gently, "we're concerned for you, for your reputation. For your daughter's future. Surely you have family back east, somewhere proper to go. My family disowned me when I married Thomas. Said he was beneath our station. Now some say Joseph is beneath me. When will I be allowed to judge for myself who deserves respect? The question hung in the air. Margaret saw various reactions ripple through the crowd, some shamefaced, some defiant, some thoughtful. Jake Prescott stood near the saloon, his head bandaged, his expression sullen. But he said nothing, perhaps aware that his credibility was shot. Mitchell stepped forward again. Think we've heard enough. Mrs. Sullivan's made her position clear. She's no captive, needs no rescue. Anyone who troubles her or White Eagle will answer to the law, and to me personally. That clear? A general murmur of assent, though not enthusiastic. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many took long looks at Margaret, at Grace in her cradleboard, at the unlikely group standing together on the platform. The storekeeper approached hesitantly. Mrs. Sullivan, got some supplies ordered. For your husband. Arrived last week. Didn't know what to do with them. Margaret felt tears threaten. Thomas's last order. Probably tools for spring planting, seeds for the garden they'd planned. Dreams that would never grow now. I'll take them, she said quietly. Mr. White Eagle can transport them. The transaction was completed quickly. The supplies included not just tools, but fabric, thread, even some toys Thomas had ordered for the baby. Each item was a fresh wound, a reminder of the future they'd lost, but also potential. Seeds could grow in new soil. Tools could build different dreams. As they prepared to leave, several women approached. Not the judgment Margaret expected, but offers of help. Baby clothes their children had outgrown, preserved food for the winter, even some precious books. The frontier, for all its hardships, could surprise with generosity. You're strong, one young woman whispered, pressing a knitted blanket into Margaret's hands. Wish I had your courage, to choose for myself, to stand up to them all. The return journey was quiet, each lost in thought. As they entered the valley, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Joseph helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hands gentle but impersonal. The day had changed something between them, made public what had been private, acknowledged implications they'd both avoided. That evening, after Sarah and Marcus had left for their own valley, Margaret and Joseph sat by the fire. Grace slept in her cradleboard, peaceful and unaware of the day's drama. The silence stretched, comfortable, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. They'll leave us alone now, Joseph finally said. Mitchell keeps his word. Others will follow. Some will, not all. There'll always be those who judge, who hate what they don't understand. Yes, question is it worth it to you? The judgment, the isolation? Could still go to the trading post, start fresh where no one knows. Easier path. Margaret considered. Today had shown her what staying meant, not just shelter in a valley, but a choice that would define her daughter's life. Grace would grow up marked as different, caught between worlds, but she'd also grow up with examples of strength, of cultures bridging differences, of love that transcended boundaries. Thomas used to say the easy path rarely leads anywhere worth going. She looked at Joseph directly. I want to stay through winter, through whatever comes, if you'll have us. Joseph's expression softened. Valley is a sanctuary. You are welcome as long as you choose. But Margaret... He used her name rarely, the sound of it intimate in the firelight. Must be clear. I offer friendship, protection, home, nothing more. Heart still belongs to ghosts, may always. I understand. My heart is no different. Thomas, what we had, that doesn't come twice. But Grace needs a future. I need purpose. Maybe we can build something new, not a replacement for what was lost, but something good, something worthy. They sat in silence again, but it was different now. Settled. Decided. Outside, an owl called, and its mate answered. The fire crackled. Grace stirred, made small sounds, settled again. "Spring will bring changes," Joseph said eventually. "Always does. But until then, we make life here, teach you more survival skills. You teach Grace. Maybe teach me things I've forgotten, how to hope, how to see the future instead of just the past." Margaret smiled. "We teach each other. That's what family does. All kinds of family, even unexpected kinds." The word hung between them, family. Not romantic love, not passion, but something perhaps deeper. Bonds forged in crisis, strengthened by choice, validated by mutual respect. The frontier demanded new definitions, new ways of being. Tonight, in a hidden valley where ancient spirits offered sanctuary, 3 broken people began writing those definitions for themselves. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy quilt, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling sound and smoothing away the rough edges of the world. The stream froze solid except where the hot springs kept patches of water flowing. Ice crystals formed fantastic sculptures on the cliff faces, catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Margaret had never experienced winter quite like this. In Philadelphia, winter meant coal fires and social calls, skating parties and holiday preparations. On the homestead with Thomas, it had been a time of struggle against cold and isolation. But here in Joseph's Valley, winter felt different. Not an enemy to be endured, but a season with its own rhythms and beauties. She learned to read the subtle signs of weather changes, to understand which snowfalls meant danger and which brought opportunity. Joseph taught her to identify animal tracks in fresh snow, to set snares along rabbit runs, to ice fish in the deeper pools. Her hands grew calloused from new tasks, scraping hides, smoking meat, maintaining the fire that must never be allowed to die completely. Grace thrived in the crystal air, growing round-cheeked and bright-eyed. The cradleboard allowed Margaret to carry her while working, and the baby seemed content to observe the world from her secure perch. Sometimes, watching Joseph's face soften when Grace gurgled at him, Margaret caught glimpses of the father he'd been. The tenderness loss hadn't managed to destroy. They developed routines that felt both foreign and natural. Mornings began before dawn, Joseph building up the fire while Margaret nursed Grace. Breakfast was simple but filling. Cornmeal mush, dried berries, tea made from pine needles and wildflowers. Then came the day's work. Endless in variety, but necessary for survival. One morning in deep January, Margaret woke to find Joseph already gone, unusual for him. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and his tracks led toward the northern ridge. She completed morning chores, fed Grace, and was contemplating searching for him when he appeared at the door, his expression troubled. "Soldiers," he said without a preamble. "Cavalry patrol, camped just beyond the North Pass." Margaret's heart tightened. "Looking for us?" "No. Hunting. But—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Hunting ghost dancers, religious movement among my people, government fears it, and once it stopped." She'd heard whispers of the ghost dance, a spiritual revival sweeping through native communities, something about bringing back the buffalo, making white men disappear, returning to the old ways. The details were vague, filtered through fear and misunderstanding. "Are they in danger, your people?" Joseph's jaw tightened. Some joined the movement, desperate people seeking hope. Now soldiers hunt them like animals. If patrol finds the winter camps, Margaret understood. Somewhere beyond their sanctuary, Lakota families huddled in winter shelters, practicing ceremonies the government had outlawed, clinging to promises of renewal. The presence of soldiers meant potential massacre. "Can you warn them?" "My cousin. Red Hawk leads one group. His camp is 2 days north. Could reach them, but—" He gestured meaningfully at Margaret and Grace. "Go," she said immediately. "We'll be fine. You've taught me well." Joseph shook his head. "Cannot leave you unprotected. If soldiers come here, find white woman with an Indian. Ask questions." "Then I'll handle it. I'm not afraid of soldiers. Not anymore. This was the truth. After facing death by fire, standing up to the town's judgment, Margaret found her fears had rearranged themselves. Your people need warning. Go. They argued briefly, but Margaret's determination won. Joseph spent the morning preparing, gathering supplies, checking weapons, ensuring Margaret knew every defensive position and escape route. He showed her signal fires that would bring Marcus Freeman if needed, and reminded her where emergency caches were hidden. 3 days, he promised. Less if possible, bar door at night, trust no strangers. Then he was gone, vanishing into the white wilderness with the same silent skill that had brought him into her life. Margaret stood on the porch, Grace in her arms, watching empty forest swallow his tracks. The valley suddenly felt vast and lonely. She kept busy through the day, mending clothes, preparing food, telling Grace stories to fill the silence. As afternoon waned, she ventured to the hot springs for water, the familiar path seeming longer without Joseph's presence. The springs steamed in the cold air, creating a pocket of warmth that felt almost magical. Margaret was filling her water containers when she heard it, the jingle of spurs, the crunch of boots on snow. She turned to find 3 soldiers emerging from the trees, their blue uniforms stark against the white landscape. The sergeant, a weathered man with calculating eyes, touched his cap. "Ma'am, didn't expect to find anyone out here, especially not a white woman." Margaret straightened, channeling every ounce of her Philadelphia breeding. "Good afternoon, Sergeant. I'm taking the waters. These springs have medicinal properties." The soldiers exchanged glances. One, younger with nervous eyes, asked, "You alone out here, Mom?" "My husband is hunting," she lied smoothly. "Should return soon. We winter here for my health. The mountain air agrees with me." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Funny, tracked an Indian to this valley. Lone man moving fast. You wouldn't know anything about that?" Margaret allowed irritation to color her voice. "I've seen no Indians, Sergeant, though I fail to see why it would concern me if I had. We're not at war, are we?" "Depends on your perspective, ma'am. There's been trouble, religious foolishness getting the tribes stirred up. This ghost dance nonsense, making them bold, dangerous. Dangerous? They're dancing, Sergeant, praying. Since when is that a crime?" The young soldier shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just dancing, ma'am. They believe their Messiah is coming, that the white man will vanish, that Buffalo will return, getting them all worked up talking about uprising." Margaret nearly laughed. "They're starving on reservations, their culture outlawed, their children taken, and you're afraid of their prayers? Perhaps if we gave them reason to hope for this world, they wouldn't need to dream of the next." "Okay." Sergeant's face hardened. "You sound like an Indian lover, ma'am. Dangerous thinking for a white woman." "I sound like a Christian, Sergeant. Didn't our Lord say to love our neighbors, to show mercy to the suffering? Or does that only apply to neighbors who look like us?" The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Margaret could see the sergeant weighing his options, the inconvenience of dealing with a white woman, the questions it would raise. Finally, he stepped back. "We'll be camping nearby tonight, for your protection, ma'am. These hills aren't safe for a woman alone. My husband will return soon. We need no protection." Nevertheless, his smile held no warmth. "Can't be too careful. Good day, ma'am." They left, but Margaret knew they hadn't gone far. She returned to the lodge, barred the door, and spent the evening in tense vigilance. Every sound made her start. Grace, sensing her mother's mood, fussed more than usual. Near midnight she heard them, footsteps circling the lodge. Testing windows, looking for evidence. Margaret sat by the fire, revolver in her lap, praying they wouldn't force entry. The footsteps eventually retreated, but sleep eluded her until dawn. The second day brought worse tension. The soldiers maintained a visible presence, always watching. The sergeant returned with new questions. Where exactly was her husband? What was his name? How long had they been here? Margaret deflected with half-truths and social graces, but felt the net tightening. That night, as she sat feeding Grace, a soft sound came from the back of the lodge. Not soldiers, they were camped by the valley entrance. This was different. Familiar, a pattern of taps she recognized. Joseph. He'd returned early. She unbarred the rear door to find him there, nearly invisible in the darkness. He slipped inside, bringing cold air and the scent of pine. His expression was grim. "Soldiers?" "3. They're suspicious, looking for you. I told them my husband was hunting." "Smart, but they won't believe much longer. Must leave. Tonight." "Leave? But the valley—" "Compromised now. They'll return with more men. Search thoroughly." He paused, pain flickering across his features. "My people are safe," warned Red Hawk. "But soldiers killed 4 warriors who tried to delay them. Young men. Boys, really." Margaret touched his arm. "I'm sorry. Always sorry. Never enough. Come, pack essentials only. Know another place, deeper in mountains. Harder to reach, but safer." They worked quickly, silently. Margaret bundled their most vital possessions while Joseph prepared travel. Packs. He fashioned a special carrier for Grace, one that would keep her warm and secure during what promised to be an arduous journey. From hidden caches, he produced snowshoes, extra furs, dried food for travel. They slipped out through the back as the eastern sky showed the first hints of dawn. Joseph led them along the cliff face, using a path Margaret hadn't known existed. The soldiers' camp lay below, men still wrapped in bedrolls around dying fires. Every step seemed impossibly loud, but no alarm came. They climbed throughout the morning, higher into mountains where snow lay deeper and wind cut sharper. Joseph broke trail, making it easier for Margaret to follow. Grace rode against her chest, bundled so thoroughly only her tiny nose showed. The baby seemed to understand the need for quiet, making no sound as they traveled. By midday, they'd reached elevations where trees grew stunted and twisted. The landscape opened into sweeping vistas, range after range of mountains extending to the horizon. Despite their situation, Margaret felt awed by the savage beauty. This was creation at its rawest, untouched by human ambition. They sheltered briefly in a cave to rest and eat. Joseph studied the sky with concern. "Storm coming. Big one, good and bad for us. How so?" "Will hide our tracks, but dangerous if caught exposed. Must reach shelter before it hits." They pushed on, racing against darkening clouds. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Margaret's world narrowed to Joseph's. Back ahead of her, the rhythm of her snowshoes, the warmth of Grace against her chest. When she stumbled, Joseph was there instantly, steadying her, encouraging her forward. The storm struck with frightening suddenness. One moment they could see their path, the next the world disappeared in horizontal snow. Joseph grabbed Margaret's, and pulling her against a rock face, he shouted words as the wind tore away, then began moving again, feeling along the stone. Time lost meaning in the white fury. Margaret focused only on maintaining contact with Joseph, on putting one foot before the other. Her face numbed, her legs burned. Still they climbed, navigating by touch and instinct through the blizzard. Just when Margaret felt she couldn't take another step, Joseph pulled her through a narrow opening in the rock. Suddenly, the wind died. They were in a cave. No, more than that. A series of connected chambers extending back into the mountain. Joseph had known exactly where to find it. He immediately set about making fire, his movements efficient despite exhaustion. Margaret collapsed against a wall, checking Grace anxiously. The baby was alert, apparently unfazed by their ordeal. As warmth began to fill the chamber, Margaret looked around in wonder. This wasn't just a natural cave. Paintings covered the walls, ancient images of animals, hunters, spirits. The ceiling bore constellations picked out in colored pigments. At the rear, a natural chimney drew smoke upward. Stone tools lay in niches. This place had sheltered humans for countless generations. Sacred place, Joseph explained, feeding the growing fire. Old ones lived here, before my people, before any tribes we know, but spirit remains. Welcome those who come in peace. As feeling returned to her extremities, Margaret explored their refuge, the main chamber connected to others, spaces for sleeping, for storage, even a tiny spring that trickled fresh water. Supplies had been cached here too, preserved by cold and altitude. They had everything needed to wait out the storm. That night, as a blizzard raged outside, they sat by ancient hearthstones where countless fires had burned. Grace slept peacefully in her furs. The cave paintings danced in firelight, seeming almost alive. Margaret felt connected to something vast and timeless, all the humans who'd sought shelter here, all the stories these walls had witnessed. "Your world is so different from mine," she said quietly. "These places, this knowledge, connections to land I never imagined." Joseph gazed at the paintings. "Not my world only, human world. Your ancestors knew such places too, sacred caves in distant lands, connection to earth. Modern world forgets, but old ways remain for those who look. Will we be safe here? Storm will last days. Soldiers cannot follow. When it clears, we decide. Continue to Far Mountain Camp. Return to the valley if soldiers are gone. Or..." He paused. "Trading posts are still possible. You could claim separation. Say I abandoned you. They would believe, would help." Margaret studied his profile in the firelight. This man who'd saved them, taught them, shared his sacred places, who now offered her an exit that would cost him nothing but would erase their shared journey. "No," she said firmly. "We stay together. Face whatever comes. Grace needs the strength you teach. I need..." She paused, searching for words. "I need to become who this land demands, who my daughter will need me to be. That doesn't happen at..." "Trading posts," Joseph nodded slowly. "Then we continue, learn, adapt, survive together." Outside, the storm raged, but within ancient walls, 3 souls had found sanctuary, not just from weather or soldiers, but from isolation, from despair, from the assumption that different worlds couldn't meet. In a cave painted by the first, dreamers' new dreams took shape, dreams of family beyond blood, of strength beyond tradition, of futures written by those brave enough to step outside the lines others drew. The fire burned low, the paintings kept their eternal watch, and in the sheltering dark, hope grew quietly, steadily, like spring beneath winter snow. The storm passed after 3 days, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay so deep it had reshaped the landscape, filling ravines and creating new contours. The sun emerged brilliant and cold, making the white expanse sparkle like a field of diamonds. Joseph stood at the cave entrance, studying the changed terrain. "Path down is gone," he announced. "Must wait for snow to settle. Find a new route." Margaret joined him, Grace secured in her cradleboard. The view was breathtaking, peaks marching into the distance, valleys filled with pristine white. No sign of human presence anywhere. It felt like standing at the beginning of creation. How long? Week, maybe more. Have supplies. Safe here. He glanced at her. But isolation is harder now. No escape, if needed. We've come this far. We'll manage. The cave became their world. Joseph showed Margaret more of its secrets. Chambers that extended deep into the mountain. Ancient fire pits where ceremonies had been held. A natural gallery where acoustics turned whispers into music. The paintings revealed stories within. Stories, layers of meaning added by successive generations. On the 4th day, they made a discovery. In a rear chamber, behind a fall of rocks that the earthquake must have shifted, lay bundles wrapped in preserved hides. Joseph approached reverently, recognizing their significance. Sacred objects, hidden long ago, maybe during the first white invasion, kept safe for future generations. With careful hands, he unwrapped the bundles. Inside were treasures beyond price, not gold or jewels, but cultural artifacts. Ceremonial pipes, beaded regalia, painted records showing historical events, medicine bundles, a shirt decorated with symbols Joseph said hadn't been used for 50 years. My grandfather spoke of these, thought lost forever. Hidden when soldiers burned villages, destroyed sacred things. His voice held wonder. Finding them now, here, with you, has meaning. Margaret felt the weight of the moment. These weren't just objects, but living connections to interrupted traditions. That Joseph would share this discovery with her. Trust her with such knowledge spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. That night, Joseph told stories the artifacts evoked, of great chiefs and medicine women, of buffalo hunts that fed entire tribes, of ceremonies that bound people to land and each other. Margaret listened, mesmerized, while Grace seemed to follow every word with serious baby attention. She understands, Joseph said, noticing. Blood knows blood. She carries all ancestors, yours and those of this land. Bridge between worlds. Margaret looked at her daughter with new eyes. Grace would grow up with stories from both traditions, would walk easily, in spaces others found impossible to navigate. The responsibility felt enormous, but also right. On the 7th day, they attempted descent. Joseph had found a possible route, treacherous but manageable. They roped themselves together for safety, Joseph leading, testing each step. The journey took hours, with several close calls when snow bridges collapsed or hidden ice sent them sliding. By afternoon, they reached the tree line. The forest felt welcoming after the exposed mountain faces. Joseph led them to a sheltered grove where they made camp, exhausted but triumphant. Tomorrow we reach a new valley, he said, higher than first, more hidden, but also harder living, must decide if it is suitable. That night brought unexpected visitors. A wolf pack drawn by their fire, circled at respectful distance. The alpha, a magnificent grey male, sat just beyond the light's reach, studying them. Margaret tensed, but Joseph remained calm. Old friends. This pack knows me, helped them once, injured a female. They remember. As if understanding, the alpha rose, gave a long look, then led his pack away. The encounter felt like benediction. Wild, accepting, tamed, another bridge crossed. The new valley, reached late the next day, proved even more beautiful than the first. Smaller, but more protected, it cradled a frozen lake that Joseph said teemed with fish in summer. A cabin stood on the southern shore, older than Joseph's lodge, built in traditional style but solid still. Hunting camp, Joseph explained. My uncle's, unused since he passed, needs work but has good bones. They spent days making it habitable. Margaret surprised herself with newfound skills, chinking walls, banking fires, even helping Joseph repair the roof. Her hands grew rougher, but more capable. She felt herself changing, becoming someone her Philadelphia family wouldn't recognize, but who felt more truly herself. Spring arrived suddenly. One day they woke to dripping icicles, the next to rushing meltwater. The lake ice boomed and cracked, finally breaking into chunks that ground against each other like giants' teeth. Deer appeared in the meadows. Birds returned in chattering. Clouds. With spring came decisions. They'd survived winter, grown close in ways neither had expected. But what now? The question hung unspoken between them as they worked side by side, preparing garden plots, repairing winter damage, watching grass grow more alert and engaged daily. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Freeman arrived one afternoon, bringing news from the outside world. The ghost dance movement had ended in tragedy at a place called Wounded Knee. Hundreds dead. The frontier was changing, he said. the old ways ending. The government was pushing final solutions to the Indian problem. There's talk of allotment, Marcus explained, breaking up tribal lands, forcing Indians to farm individual plots, destroying communal life. Joseph, they're looking for you specifically. Someone reported seeing you with a white woman. They're calling you a renegade kidnapper. There's a warrant. Margaret felt cold anger. That's absurd. I've made my choice clear. Doesn't matter. Narrative serves their purpose. Dangerous Indian corrupting white woman justifies whatever they plan. Marcus looked between them. You need to disappear, both of you. Go somewhere they won't look, Canada maybe, or deeper into mountains where even the army won't follow. That night they held a council. The fire burned low as they weighed options. Stay and fight? Run farther? Separate for safety? Each choice carried terrible risks. I won't leave you, Margaret said firmly. We're family now. Whatever comes, we face together. Joseph studied her across the fire. Months of shared hardship had burned away pretense, leaving only truth between them. Being with me marks you, makes Grace a target too, forever outside both worlds. Then we make our own world, like the Freemans did, like others must be doing. The frontier is ending, yes, but something new begins. We can help shape it. Grace stirred in her sleep, making small sounds. Both adults looked at her, this child born in fire, raised in hidden valleys, heir to multiple traditions. She would need strength they could only give together. There is a place, Joseph said slowly, Sacred Mountain. Treaty protects it still. Hidden valley near summit where hot springs create warmth year-round. Could build there, live quietly, raise Grace, wait for the world to change. How far? 2 weeks' travel, difficult but possible. If we leave soon, before the government moves, before summer brings more soldiers. Margaret nodded. Another journey. Another home, but this time chosen freely by both. Not running from, but moving toward. Toward a future they would write themselves, outside the lines others drew. Marcus promised to spread false information about their direction. Sarah sent supplies and blessings. They prepared carefully, taking only essentials, plus the sacred bundles, from the cave. Joseph crafted a special carrier for Grace, who at 6 months was bright-eyed and curious about everything. The morning they left, a golden eagle circled overhead. Joseph took it as a sign. They climbed away from the valley that had sheltered them, heading toward distant peaks where their future waited. Behind them, spring flowers bloomed where their garden would have been. Ahead, mountains rose like promises, into the clear sky. At the pass, they paused to look back. The valley lay beautiful in the morning light, but it was just a place now. Home was the three of them, moving together toward whatever came next. Grace laughed, reaching for something only she could see. Margaret adjusted the pack Joseph had taught her to carry. Joseph studied the route ahead, with eyes that saw possibilities, not obstacles. They walked forward together, 3 souls bound by choice and circumstance, writing a story the world didn't expect, but couldn't prevent. Somewhere ahead waited a place where they could simply be. Until then, the journey itself was home enough. 7 years had passed like seasons in the hidden valley of the sacred mountain. Grace ran barefoot through meadows where hot springs kept the earth warm even in winter, her laughter echoing off ancient peaks. She was a child of 2 worlds, speaking English and Lakota with equal fluency, knowing the Latin names of plants from her mother's books and their medicinal uses from Joseph's teaching. Margaret stood at the door of their cabin, built strong and true with logs they'd cut together. That first difficult year, her hands were no longer soft as they'd been in Philadelphia, but skilled in ways she couldn't have imagined. She could deliver a breech calf, set a broken bone, identify edible plants by leaf shape alone. The woman who'd once worn silk gowns, to society balls now dressed in practical leather and homespun, her dark hair streaked prematurely with silver, but her eyes bright with purpose. Joseph emerged from the forest with Grace perched on his shoulders, both carrying baskets of late summer herbs. The years had aged him too, but gently. The grief that had once shadowed his features had softened into something more like acceptance. He smiled more now, especially when teaching Grace the stories painted on their home's walls. Tales from both traditions woven together into something new. "Mama, look!" Grace called, holding up a handful of roots. "Father says these will help with your headaches. We found them by the Eagle Rocks." Margaret smiled at how naturally Grace used both terms, Mama and Father, English and Lakota words, blending in her speech like streams joining into a river. Their daughter was growing tall for 7, with Margaret's determination and Joseph's quiet strength, Thomas's green eyes, and the rich brown skin that marked her mixed heritage. "Well done, little bird. Wash them carefully and we'll dry them for winter." As Grace ran to comply, Joseph set down his basket and studied Margaret with the careful attention that had become second nature. "Your dreams were troubled again last night." She nodded. The dreams had been coming more frequently, not nightmares exactly, but urgent visions. Faces of children she didn't recognize, voices calling in languages she didn't understand, a sense of purpose unfulfilled. The same ones, children lost between worlds, like Grace might have been without. She gestured at their life, their home, the sanctuary they'd built. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then, "The Spirit sends such dreams for a reason. Perhaps it is time to open our sanctuary, share what we've learned." It was a conversation they'd had before. Their valley had remained hidden, protected by treaty rights and geographic isolation. But the world beyond was changing rapidly. They heard fragments when Marcus visited. Indian boarding schools forcing children to forget their languages, mixed-blood children rejected by both communities, families torn apart by policies designed to civilize through separation. That evening, as they shared their simple meal, Grace chattered about her day's discoveries. She'd found a new bird's nest, identified the tracks of a young bear, helped Joseph repair a section of irrigation channel. Margaret watched her daughter with wonder. Grace moved through their world with complete confidence, seeing no contradiction. Between reading Shakespeare by firelight and learning to track elk through fresh snow, "Father's teaching me the star stories," Grace announced, "how the first woman placed the patterns to guide hunters home, but Mama showed me the Greek names. And 2, why do the same stars have different stories? Because people see what their hearts need to see," Joseph answered. "Stars don't change, but each people finds their own truth in the patterns." "Like us," Grace said matter-of-factly. "We make our own pattern, different from others but just as true." Margaret exchanged glances with Joseph. Their daughter understood, more than they sometimes realized. That night, after Grace slept, they sat by the fire as they had so many nights before. But something felt different. The comfortable silence held expectation, like the pause before thunder. "Tell me about the dreams," Joseph said finally. Margaret gathered her thoughts. "I see a school, not like the government schools that destroy. Culture, different, a place where children like Grace could learn both ways. Where mixed blood doesn't mean caught between, but blessed with double wisdom. Where families stay together while learning. Vision school, like the old teaching lodges, but in a new form. Yes, and I see you teaching, not just hunting and tracking, but deeper knowledge, the stories, the connections, and I teach too, reading, writing, mathematics, but also frontier skills, making education mean survival and thriving, not just memorizing." Joseph stared into the fire. "Such a place would draw attention. Government wouldn't approve, too threatening to their plans, unless we were clever, called it something acceptable. Agricultural school maybe, vocational training. Hide the real purpose behind practical education they couldn't object to. They, talked through the night, plans taking shape like sculpture emerging from stone. By dawn, the dream had become a possibility. They would expand their sanctuary carefully, invite selected families, those with mixed heritage children, those seeking different paths, build slowly, quietly, create what the world needed, but didn't know how to ask for. The first family arrived the following spring. David and Mary Clearwater, he white, she crow, their 3 children caught painfully between worlds. The oldest boy, Samuel, had run away from boarding school 3 times. The younger girls were afraid to speak their mother's language even at home. The family was fracturing under pressure to choose sides in a world that demanded singular identity. Margaret watched Grace approach the newcomers with characteristic directness. Within an hour, she was showing Samuel her favorite fishing spots. By evening, the girls were helping her feed the chickens, giggling at the rooster's pompous strutting. Children, Margaret reflected, found bridges adults couldn't see. More families followed. Juan and Rebecca Valdez, whose children carried Apache and Mexican heritage. The Changs, whose son was half Chinese, half Sioux, welcome nowhere. The Antonellis, whose adopted Blackfoot daughter was struggling in white schools. Each family brought skills, stories, traditions to share. Joseph supervised construction of new cabins, each built with respect for the land. Margaret organized classes that honored all traditions. Morning lessons might include Shakespeare and algebra, alongside hide tanning and plant identification. Afternoons brought language classes where children taught each other words from their various heritages. Evenings were for stories. Every culture represented adding threads to a tapestry none could have woven alone. Grace blossomed in the company of other children. She became an assistant teacher, translator, and bridge builder. Watching her help, a Korean Lakota boy find pride in his dual heritage, or teach a German Cherokee girl traditional beadwork, Margaret felt the rightness of their path. But growth brought challenges. Supplies were needed. Contact with the outside world became necessary, and eventually, inevitably, questions arose. The territorial governor arrived on a crisp autumn day, accompanied by an Indian agent and a school inspector. Their faces were stern with official disapproval as they surveyed what had been reported as an irregular educational establishment. Mrs. Sullivan, the governor began, then paused. Or is it Mrs. White Eagle now? I am Margaret Sullivan, she replied calmly. Joseph White Eagle is my partner in this educational enterprise. We are not legally married, but share commitment to these children's futures. The inspector sniffed. Most irregular. These children should be in proper schools. Indian children especially need civilizing influences. They receive those, Joseph stepped forward, along with practical skills, traditional knowledge, languages that may prove valuable as our nation grows more connected to the world. We prepare them for futures we cannot fully imagine. The governor studied the children working in the garden, others practicing letters on slate boards under trees. I see white children learning alongside Indians. This promotes understanding, Margaret interrupted. Cooperation, mutual respect. Are these not American values? The Indian agent spoke up. The mixing of cultures creates confusion. Children need a clear identity. These mixed bloods especially must choose which world they belong to. Grace chose that moment to approach, leading a group of children. They carried a traditional drum alongside a violin, wore clothing that mixed cultural elements naturally. Without prompting, they began a performance. A Lakota honor song followed, by a Celtic fiddle tune, then something entirely new that blended both traditions. We don't choose between worlds, Grace said when they finished. We make new ones. The officials departed without closing the school, though Margaret suspected the reprieve was temporary. Word of their experiment spread. Some condemned it as dangerous mixing, others saw hope for a different future. Letters arrived from distant places, parents seeking help for children caught between cultures, teachers interested in their methods, even scholars wanting to document their approach. One letter stood out. It came from Thomas's sister in Boston, whom Margaret hadn't heard from since his death. The tone was different from the condemnation she'd expected. "My dear Margaret, word has reached us of your extraordinary work. I confess I was wrong to oppose your marriage to my brother. He saw something in you that convention obscured. Now I understand. You are building what he dreamed of, a place where divisions matter less than shared humanity. I am elderly now, with no children of my own. I wish to support your school. Enclosed is a bank draft. Use it to expand your mission. Make my brother's dream live." The gift was substantial. It allowed them to build proper classrooms, acquire books, develop curriculum that satisfied government requirements while preserving their deeper purpose. They hired additional teachers. Sarah Freeman taught traditional crafts, Marcus offered wilderness skills, and a Chinese scholar named Li Wei brought mathematics and astronomy from another ancient tradition. Years passed. Children grew, graduated, went into the world carrying seeds of change. Some became teachers themselves, others entered business, agriculture, medicine. All carried the lesson that identity need not be singular, that strength came from embracing all parts of one's heritage. Grace, now 15, had grown into a young woman of remarkable poise. She moved easily between worlds, translating not just languages but cultures. When government inspectors came, she could discuss classical literature and advanced mathematics. When tribal elders visited, she knew the proper protocols, the old stories, the subtle meanings in traditional songs. One evening, as sunset painted the mountains gold, Margaret found Joseph at their favorite overlook. Below them, the valley buzzed with life. Children playing, adults working, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. What had begun as a sanctuary for three souls had become community, school, hope for a different future. "Do you regret?" she asked. "The life that might have been, the simplicity we lost?" Joseph considered. "My first family was taken. That wound never fully heals. But from loss came this." He gestured at the valley. "These children will walk easier in the world because we walked hard paths first. Purpose born from pain. The spirits work in circles." Margaret leaned against him, a gesture of companionship that had replaced any romantic love. Theirs was a partnership of different kind, deeper perhaps for being chosen daily rather than driven by passion. "Thomas would be proud. Both your wife and son would be proud. We've built something worthy." Of their memory, Grace joined them, bringing news. Father, Mama, riders approaching, flying government flags. They descended to meet whatever new challenge awaited. The lead rider dismounted, producing official documents. "By order of the President of the United States," he began formally. "In recognition of extraordinary service to education and cultural understanding, this institution is hereby granted formal charter as an experimental school. Federal protection and funding are approved, with Ms. Margaret Sullivan and Mr. Joseph White Eagle named as co-directors." Margaret stood stunned. Political winds had shifted. Progressive voices in Washington had prevailed. Their experiment was not just tolerated, but endorsed. The celebration that night was joyous, but tinged with awareness. Recognition brought new responsibilities, new scrutiny. The work would continue, but on a larger stage. More children would come. More families would find hope. The bridge they'd built would bear heavier traffic. As the evening wound down, Margaret walked alone to the small cemetery where they'd laid markers for Thomas, for Joseph's wife and son, for all the losses that had led to this moment. The stars were brilliant overhead. The same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight through flame, her daughter's birth, the long journey to this place. "We did it," she whispered to the silent graves. "Not the life any of us planned, but maybe the one that was needed." A hand touched her shoulder. Joseph stood beside her, Grace at his other side. They remained there as the sky darkened and stars emerged. Three souls who had found each other in loss and built something larger than any had imagined possible. In the valley below, children slept peacefully, dreaming of futures where identity was rich tapestry rather than a narrow path, where the difference was strength, where bridges connected rather than divided, where love took many forms, family had many faces, and hope was taught passed from one generation to the next. The hidden valley of the sacred mountain kept its secrets while sharing its wisdom. And in the great story of the American frontier, a new chapter was being written by those brave enough to imagine different endings, to build sanctuaries not just from the world, but for it, to prove that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to choose between worlds when you can create something beautiful from both. The school thrived. The children grew. The future, uncertain but full of promise, waited to be written by hands that knew multiple alphabets, hearts that held multiple songs, minds that saw multiple truths as facets of one greater light. And in the annals of territorial history, a small notation appeared: Educational Innovation in the Mountains, the Sullivan White Eagle School, where Eastern learning meets Western wisdom, and children discover themselves complete. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.